Hello, this is another interview with Yuri Felshtinsky. Please subscribe, like or dislike, share. It'll help to promote this video on YouTube. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your attention and thank you for inviting me. You know, there are times when nothing happens, but these days it is such a time that every day brings something new and something big. It has to do with the war in Ukraine and with the situation in the United States. But I would like to start with a different topic. Quite a big event happened. They announced that they will sign an armistice treaty between Israel and Hamas. I would like to find out from you, how do you evaluate this treaty and do you think it can live long? And what would be your political assessment of it? I'm skeptical about it. I don't think that this treaty can live long. I think that in Israel they take it skeptically, and the most surprising thing is that in Arab world they also take it quite skeptically. The problem that we face is quite serious, and as usual in such cases, I think we shouldn't be trying to cut the heads of this multi-faced beast, but we need to try to hit the heart of this beast. And the heart of this horrible beast is Iran, and let's be frank, here we can make a certain analogy. It is like we can't finish the war in Ukraine without dethroning or changing the Russian regime. The same way we can't finish the war between Israel and the Arab world without finding the heart of the dragon. In this case, at this historical stage, because of course the anti-Semitism problem in the world is just as old as the world itself, but at this particular stage it is clear that many things, not everything, but many things lead to Iran. And until the civilized countries find the strength and political decisiveness to hit Iran and to set a goal to change the regime in Iran, I think there won't be peace in Israel, because with the existence of various terrorist factions and organizations, and they're mainly funded from Iran, and not only from Iran, you can also find the Saudi Arabian money that comes from Qatar. They're just trying not to expose themselves too much. But in political and military terms, this is Iran. Therefore, if the new American administration will really live up to its promises and hints when they were saying that Iran will be hit because of the continuous war with Israel, after that maybe we'll see some light in this problem. But we do understand, and this fact people don't keep in mind, that Israel is a country of 10 million people, and in fact a certain percentage of people in this country, the Arabs, and this country of 10 million people is of a size of a medium European city. Well, say not medium city, but an European capital in the world. So this number could be compared with Moscow, London, or New York, or some other cities. So this one city is sieged by the 800 million people Arab world. Yuri, I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you because we need to stay on the track, otherwise it will be difficult to get back to it. So when we're talking about this armistice, and it seems that this armistice was imposed on Israel, there was quite a serious pressure from the public opinion, and we have information that more than 70% of Israelis they support this type of treaty. At the same time, we have a feeling that this treaty was imposed on Israel by the United States, the main ally of Israel. Do you think it's right? Well, you see, here we also can make parallels with Russia and Ukraine. In Israel, every human life counts, in contrast to the Arab world, where they have a completely different approach to this problem. In that world, they don't care about victims much. They're more concerned about some other things, maybe more fundamental. But in Israel, every human life counts. Therefore, when Palestinian terrorists or some other terrorists, they take one person hostage, then they can exchange this one person for thousands of terrorists. Yuri, again, sorry for interrupting you. Maybe some of our viewers don't know. Here we're talking about the exchange of 33 Israelis for terrorists. For one civilian, they release 30 terrorists, and for a soldier, for Israeli soldier, they release 50 terrorists. Sorry for interrupting you. See, the problem is that this system is vicious, and it is vicious because it creates an incentive for terrorists to take more and more hostages. And we know the ending of this story, and the ending is that Israelis are ready to exchange alive or dead hostages for absolutely alive terrorists who have been sentenced. And in this case, some of them are doing time in Israeli prisons. No doubt that this treaty is imposed on Israel, and it is imposed by the United States, first of all, and the public opinion of the whole world, second of all. And it is absolutely clear that in this case, maybe most of all, the pressure was applied by Trump and his administration. And for Trump, it was important because he promised that Israelis will get their hostages back before he enters the White House. That's why for him it was very important to sign the treaty before January 20th. But using an analogy with a similar treaty that was signed, but not signed, realized in January of 1980, when Ronald Reagan came to the White House, and he freed American hostages from Iranian prisons. So therefore, again, the pressure was applied on Israelis, and Netanyahu has a pretty good relationship with Trump, and much better relationship than with Biden, and even better than with Obama. And Netanyahu submitted to Trump here, but it might happen so that this treaty won't be, say, real. Because yesterday, despite the armistice, Israelis had to launch strikes against some terrorist camps. Well, it's not only the exchange, it was also about ceasing fire, and it was a territorial discussion, something else. Yes, it is a ceasefire. It is also removing Israeli troops from the territory of the Gaza Strip, and also another very important issue. This is the border with Egypt and the tunnel through the border, and through the border they organize shipments of military equipment. Frankly speaking, I don't see any light in this treaty, and I don't think that Israelis see any light in this treaty. And sadly, I don't think that this treaty will bring peace and calm to Israel. But well, that's the destiny of Israel. And by the way, looking at the situation in Israel, oftentimes we hear this talk. Sometimes it's Russian opposition keeps blaming other people. It's very interesting that the situation in Israel, that it seems to me should be taken pretty clearly, and after this horrible invasion of Hamas and all those atrocities they committed, and it seemed that there shouldn't be two opinions for the civilized world, for the Western world. Nevertheless, we see that the position in the Western world and in the Western media, and even within the Russian opposition community, those who are anti-Ukrainian war, and that turned out, this issue turned out to be a stumbling block. Maybe these are the roots of anti-Semitism, maybe this is left liberal agenda that's been imposed, but that seems to be a fact. We spoke about inauguration, and there are lots of events coming, and lots of concerns and expectations in the context of Ukraine. Mostly there are international aspects of it. Yesterday we had the last speech of Biden. He was about to leave the office, and he was concluding his presidency. Yuri, you know what's happening in America pretty well, and how would you evaluate the outcomes of Joseph Biden? You know, it would have been better if he had lost the election of 2020, frankly speaking. It would have been better if Trump had his 8 years back then, and America would take some different path, because sadly it turned out that Biden, who didn't keep his word, and he promised when he became president, he promised that he's not going to run for the second term, and this is how he confused the whole country. And what happened as a result of it, he led the Democratic Party to its failure. And now America, for the next 4 years, is in Trump's hands. And Trump has an absolute carte blanche to do any policy. And right now we won't hear any objections. Well, we may hear some objections from the side of the Democratic Party that is in minority. Yes, their positions are very weak. They're probably in their lowest point today. Yes, you're right. They lost it everywhere, in all institutions, in the Senate, in Congress, in the Supreme Court, in the White House. So therefore, now we will see a lot of unexpected things. The irony is that the Americans, according to the public polls, and we know this information before the election, the Americans were not interested in the foreign policy. Only 2-3% of the Americans believed that the foreign policy was an important issue in the elections. But the changes will be happening mostly in the foreign policy, in the sector that Americans traditionally and historically, it's not something new, they're not concerned with it. Besides the point that those foreign policy issues are a concern of Trump, and this is what happened in the American tradition, that American presidents in the issues of foreign policy, they almost have dictators' powers. The law doesn't limit them, and the president can unilaterally determine the policy of the United States internationally. And here I don't expect anything good. And in fact, on the contrary, I expect that the next 4 years will be very difficult for Europe, because Trump's goal, say his main obligation to Putin, and in this case Putin is quite an important player. Trump's main goal is to give up Ukraine. This is the main foreign policy goal for him. Okay, Yuri, from this point, let's speak in more detail. It is clear that electing Trump kind of put the situation in the air, and many people are afraid of this scenario that Ukraine will be given up. And it's clear that only by indirect signs we can tell what Trump will be doing. And in fact, today we got information that was published by Bloomberg, and Trump said that he's going to toughen the sanctions in order to pressure Putin to make him accept the scenario that Trump wants. So you think that this is one of Trump's goals? Yes, and nevertheless, don't you think that for Trump to start his presidency with this would be to stain himself in the history? And it would seem that being in such an age and having his second term, one would want to do something significant, something important, and to start the presidency with giving up Ukraine to Putin and to escalate the situation and to endanger his NATO allies, for example, Baltic countries. So this actually contradicts his interests, not only as a political leader, but also it contradicts his ego. How can he combine his ego with giving up Ukraine to Putin? Well, first of all, Trump is not going to say that his goal is to give up Ukraine. We're not going to see this. We'll see how it was already promised. And we don't need to pretend that this is some sort of unexpected things for us. We'll see that Trump will stop supporting Ukraine, and I think we'll see it right away. So what will be the cause of it? What do you think? By the way, Yuri, it is very interesting. Now we are laying out certain things, but then it would be very interesting to see whether it happened or not. And it's great that we're doing this interview before the inauguration. So it turns out that Zelensky and Ukraine will be presented with such demands that Ukraine wouldn't accept. And based on this, Trump will stop supporting Ukraine, right? Well, you see here it's the same type of problems that we can see in Israeli-Arab conflict. Let's get back to Israel for a second. They demand from Israel such things that Israel cannot agree with, and the main demand is that Israel has to stop his existence, in fact, to commit suicide. And this is in the program of the Arab world, not of the whole Arab world, but say it's in the agenda of Iran. It's written pretty boldly there that such a state as Israel doesn't exist. There is only a temporarily occupied territory. The same thing that Putin was saying about Ukraine. So there is no such a state as Ukraine. There is some territorial entity that is a historical error, and they call themselves Ukraine, and this state has no right to exist. That's why the negotiation process is impossible. It is impossible between Israel and the Arab world and between Ukraine and Russia. Because for the negotiation process to be possible, the Arab world has to agree that Israel has the right to exist, and Russia has to agree that Ukraine has the right to exist. And after that, we can discuss something. So, of course, we can dream about the negotiation process between Israel and the Arab world and the negotiation process between Russia and Ukraine, but due to the same reason, I don't believe in either one. Until we have Putin's regime in Russia, and Putin's regime, this is FSB, the Secret Service, in power, and Putin kind of personifies this regime. He's not a dictator, he's not like Lukashenko in Belarus. He represents FSB in power, and until FSB is in power in Russia, there won't be any peace in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, of course, but at this point it is Ukraine. That's why we will see, and we're beginning to see this, some smoke screens. And Trump produces these smoke screens, say, adding Canada to the United States, purchase or takeover of Greenland, bringing back the Panama Canal. In fact, all three projects, and let's be frank here, they hardly will be realized. Canada most probably won't want to become the 51st state of the United States. Well, it's determined. Canada won't want it. In fact, this is a very weak idea, I'd say, and it ended up with like public name-calling from Musk's side, and it's clear that this is completely a shallow project. But what about Greenland? Well, with Greenland, it brings us back to Europe and closer to Ukraine. You see, Greenland, if you think about it, it's Europe, and at this point, it is the territory of Denmark, and Denmark is a member of NATO. And you see, I think this is what we're going to hear from Trump. And it's not going to be just the fact that he is pushing that Ukraine is to blame for the war. He is saying that this is Ukraine's fault, this is Biden's fault, that Biden provoked Ukraine with his promises that Ukraine will be joining NATO. So we'll hear something like that, or some other variations of this. But in all cases, what we'll hear that in the war with Russia, Ukraine is to blame, and that's why Ukraine is supposed to deal with the problem on its own, and that some territories of Ukraine obviously are lost for Ukraine, starting with Crimea, and this is a new reality. So all this smoke screen with Greenland, Canada, and with Panama Canal, the main goal of it is to lull our vigilance and to change our point of view in the matter of taking over foreign territories. And the attempt to add to America a part of Denmark, and Denmark is an ally of America and a member of NATO, let's say it's a little bit incorrect approach to the matter. Well, yes, right, I would put it mildly incorrect. Yes, we're trying to speak mildly, and mildly and a little bit ironic. So it is not a correct way to approach it, especially if we suppose that all that is declared at rallies. He's not doing it through the channels of secret diplomacy, which would have been okay to discuss certain matters with your allies. They could have sent a top-secret letter of the President of the United States to the government of Denmark saying that America would like to consider certain matters of lease, purchase, or annexation territory of Greenland based on such and such conditions, and are there such conditions that Greenland would politely agree to become part of the United States. Maybe such conditions do exist, but at least this could have been done politely, diplomatically, without harming Denmark or the United States. Trump has absolutely different goal. His goal is to fall out with all his allies. And it's not incidental that they brought up the issue of annexing Canada. And they brought another issue that Mexico should be punished for the open border with the United States, and they're going to introduce some economic sanctions against Mexico. But Mexico and Canada are the largest trade partners of the United States. It's not China, it's not Europe, it's not Russia, God forbid. It is Mexico and Canada. And the first thing that Trump does, he declares his absolutely hostile attitude to his main trade partners and to NATO, to his largest and the main political partner in Europe. So this is the realization of Trump's motto, America will be great again. Yuri, I will be interrupting you from time to time because our format is more like a dialogue. It's extremely interesting to listen to you. You have a very systematic approach to all these issues, and just not to lose the point, I would like to get back to it. Can we say that at the point when officially Trump is not the president yet, they are trying to bring to the agenda of the international policy the right of the strong, that allows to change the situation on land, and they say in the Kremlin oftentimes, or these are just the steps to promote some other decisions. Well, in fact, this right of the strong just recently, which was also quite curious to watch, Putin, I think, declared it. Yes, right, Putin does that, and he's doing it for many years, but that was kind of more of a marginal agenda. Well, Putin declared that, yes, that happens like that, so it's just the right of the strong. We want to take over Ukraine because we have strength and power. So we conquer Ukraine. Trump is trying to declare the same thing, but because we know that he's not going to get Canada, and I can bet anyone that he's not going to get Greenland, and even he's not going to get Panama Canal, that in fact was given back to Panama by Jimmy Carter, who just passed away. And I think maybe that's the reason he remembered about Panama Canal, or maybe he watched the movie The Tailor from Panama, and that's why he had this idea to get Panama Canal back. I'm saying that this is a smokescreen, and this is the reason. He does it to announce to the Americans that Putin's desire to get Ukraine, or maybe not only Ukraine, because Putin's appetite may grow, and it's okay. Yes, it's okay. Putin wants to get Ukraine. We want to get Canada, see? And Putin is not telling us anything about it. Well, you see, he's trying to introduce it to the discourse, to the international discourse. Sorry, Yuri, I'm interrupting you again. Remember, at some point in time, when it was a total madness, there was this propaganda guy, Kiselyov, propaganda host on one of the propaganda channel in Russia, I mean Dmitry Kiselyov. And he was saying that Russia is able to turn the United States into radioactive ashes. And even back then, for the Russian audience, it was absolutely insane, because it contradicted the decades of the feeling that the nuclear subject cannot be brought up at all. But now, more often, we see that they seriously discuss some tactical nuclear strikes, and at these propaganda channels they discuss how fast Russian submarines can get to the shore, and how fast the missiles fly, and so on. Some insane idea is thrown in the discourse, and discussing it becomes a norm. And here we see a very similar situation. First, they're talking about something completely insane, something that contradicts everything that we're used to and the system of the international security, but sometime later, even a month didn't pass, and then it is discussed with some facts in their hands. Can we make such an analogy? Yes, you're absolutely right. And in fact, the topic of a nuclear war actually indicates that 3 years ago, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, nobody in their serious mind would discuss the topic of nuclear strike against Russian Federation, and now it is discussed on all levels. Lukashenko is saying that Belarus is dropping out from the non-nuclear status, and they're transferring nuclear weapons to Belarus, and then Lukashenko is threatening Lithuania and Poland, and he's saying there's going to be a nuclear strike against these countries, and then Karaganev's article about nuclear strike against Europe. And now we are talking about the nuclear war as if it's just a little prank of some gang of terrorists or hooligans. In fact, yes, it became the given. And in Europe, it is a norm to discuss it. Yes, it's possible that Russia might launch a strike against Ukraine, nuclear strike against Ukraine and some European country, and already in Sweden and Finland, they're seriously getting ready for such a possibility. They're building bomb shelters in case of a nuclear strike. So this is a new reality, and it is a new order. And now this new order in the world is added by Trump, who is saying, yes, we can reconsider the borders. It's okay. There is nothing wrong with it. And I emphasize again, I think that all this is just a smokescreen to give up Ukraine. But when I'm saying to give up Ukraine, I would like to say that sadly it will be giving up Europe. Because Europe is not going to give up on Ukraine. And I guarantee it. I guarantee it to Ukrainians, if they're listening to us. I'm sure that Ukrainian citizens are listening to us. And in response to Trump's stopping supporting Ukraine, we'll hear the announcement of the European Union that Europe will be helping Ukraine to fight back, to defend itself from Russia. Because everybody understands that if this dam that is the military forces of Ukraine, and if this dam is broken and by Russia, and in 3 days Russia will march to Moldova and will continue its march to the Baltic countries. By the way, Yuri, I would like to say, first of all, those who are watching our stream, please like our video. They recommend it for us because it helps to bring the video in the top in YouTube's for the YouTube viewers. And in the context of what we're talking about, I got a question to Yuri. Yuri is one of the best analysts. Could you ask him, please, what the future to expect for the Baltic countries? I'm from Latvia. Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. For the last 3 years, since the beginning of the war, many important events happened in Europe. First of all, finally, Europe realized what is the danger that is coming from Russian Federation and from Putin, and for these 3 years, it properly prepared for a war. So it shouldn't be underestimated. Whereas the Russian army, that is used to be considered the second army in the world, turned out to be nothing. Because after the 3 years of the bloody war in which Russia lost more than in any other war after the Second World War, Russia didn't really manage to make significant progress in Ukraine. The sector where they're making some progress, this is where they started the war in 2014, and there that war is lasting for 10 years. But as we know, in the Kiev sector, their offensive failed. That's why the Russian army on land at this point is not a threat. Russia doesn't have an army to invade the Eastern Europe because for the same 3 years the military forces of Poland, Baltic countries were significantly improved, and Finland and Sweden joined NATO, and this is the countries that are going to hold the front, and they can hold the front. So that's why a prospect of an on-land invasion in Eastern Europe is very weak. I many times said on many streams, I'm concerned with the fact of presence, if it actually is there, because many people actually doubt that. I mean, the presence of nuclear weapons in Belarus, and I'm very much concerned with Lukashenko in Belarus. And I spoke about it many times, that in the interests of European security, Lukashenko's regime should be overthrown and democracy should be restored in Belarus, and Belarus is ready for that, and we know it because of all these rallies and protests that were in Belarus. Maybe they were not as spectacular in terms of the victory as Maidan was in Ukraine, but of course we can compare those rallies with Ukraine and Maidan. But we have to admit that they were crushed. Yes, they were crushed, but we will see what's going to happen after the new election in Belarus. This is another election where Lukashenko will be faking the votes, and we'll see how the Belarus public reacts to it. But I think that the most important stage in guaranteeing the peace in Europe will be overthrowing Lukashenko. Yuri, do you think it's actually real? Because we spoke about it. We have a lot of Belarusians here, and we spoke about it with them. Can we speak about sovereignty of Belarus? Because for many years we saw Lukashenko's attempts to sit on both chairs. He was trying to please both Moscow and the West, and he was trying to use his unique position to use this transit zone to make money. But after he actually lost the election in 2020, in fact, he is still in power only because he completely gave up Belarus sovereignty to Putin, to Putin's hands. And is there any chance that that Putin and the Kremlin will allow Belarus to be free and to allow any changes in Belarus. You know, as the United States and Europe, they both are to blame for the Russian occupation and Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fact that the war lasts for 3 years. Europe, in many ways, is to blame for Lukashenko's being in power, and exactly due to the reasons that you just named, because Lukashenko is a sly politician, he's very cruel, he's bloody, and yes, he is sitting on those two chairs, and Assad was doing the same, he was sitting on several chairs at once. The same Lukashenko does, he is pretty stubborn, and as any dictator, and we just saw what happened in Syria with Assad, dictatorships are very fragile regimes, and the fact that Lukashenko's regime could be overthrown for just a week, I can actually guarantee it. Well, if it's not for a week, then for 2 weeks for sure, because Lukashenko has no support. Of course, he has all those secret agencies under him and the law enforcement agencies, but not all of them support him. And at the same time, there are many forces abroad, and those forces can deal with overthrowing Lukashenko, starting with the volunteer regiments that are part of Ukrainian military forces. Mainly, you're talking about the regiment of Kalinovsky. Yes, regiment of Kalinovsky, but it's not the only one. The main thing that Ukrainian leadership, due to their own reasons, and I'm sure that those reasons have certain grounds, Ukrainian leadership doesn't make a goal to overthrow Lukashenko, because Belarus volunteer regiments would be enough to enter Belarus and to try to overthrow Lukashenko. But given the fact that Ukrainian army, and we can see it by the example of Kursk operation, Ukrainian army can cross Ukrainian border and to do the offensive on the enemy territory, and Belarus is an enemy territory, and there shouldn't be any doubt about this, because from the Belarus side they started the main offensive onto Kiev, and nobody said that Russia will not repeat it. And until Belarus is under Russian control, there will always be threat to Kiev, to Poland, and to Europe. And if we look at the map, then it's clear that including Belarus in the EU and NATO will be a guarantee of European security. Yuri, I'm sorry, let me speculate on that. So how can it be correlated with Trump's agreements about giving up some territories, fixating, so to speak, the occupied territories? On the one hand, we're saying yes, Belarus is a very important bridgehead. But even in the context of Ukraine, for a long time we've seen a lack of political will in the Western European countries. Besides, there are some countries that actually have an anti-Ukrainian position, a pro-Kremlin position. So how valid these conversations are today? They can give Ukraine enough military equipment. They have, and I think they do have it as a whole as Europe, and here is Belarus. And will they try to include it in EU? Let's be frank. Well, first of all, yes, they don't give enough military equipment to Ukraine, and they don't do it because they're concerned to escalate the war to the nuclear war. This nuclear blackmail from the side of Putin that is, in my view, is total bluff, and in this case it works because, of course, it's very hard to guarantee that Russia will not use the nuclear weapons, and that's why everybody's afraid of it, and this bluff works. But nevertheless, over the years, they didn't form a strategy of the West, because the strategy of the West in this war is still in the fact that Russia will get exhausted and it will stop itself. So our task as the West to give Ukraine enough weapons so that Ukraine could hold the front, but God forbid to win, because if Ukraine wins or it begins to win, and then Putin will get upset, will be very disappointed, maybe who knows, he may use nuclear weapons. When I say that Putin may get upset and disappointed, there is also a bit of truth in it, because there are people who don't want Russia to be defeated, because in this case there is a danger that Russia may use nuclear weapons. But at the same time, there are people who don't want Russia to be defeated, because in this case Russia may get disintegrated, and there will be smaller states there, and it will destabilize Europe. I can tell you even more. This fear of uncertainty in case of Russia's loss, and in case of collapse of Putin's regime as a result of it, and with a high probability of disintegration of Russia, if not even disintegration of Russia, but maybe some territories leave the Russian Federation. And there is a concern that there might be some uncontrolled chaos. And this is what really concerns everybody, all bureaucrats and politicians of the Western countries. And of course, there is the factor of uncontrolled nuclear weapons. But I absolutely agree with you that this could sound strange, that not to allow Putin to lose in this war, and I think that this kind of in people's heads, and this situation doesn't change at all. Yes, this situation doesn't change still, and I think that Trump will stop being a factor of the European policy. I think that after it will be clear that America can't or doesn't want to help Europe in that real conflict, the conflict with the Russian Federation, Trump, who is unpopular, let's be frank, he's not popular in Europe, he won't be a factor anymore, and America, to a certain degree, will not be a factor. Maybe it's good, because for a long time we saw how the European countries who are living this balanced and happy life, and they have this idea in their head that they have this roof as NATO, and mainly the United States. 60% of NATO is funded by the American money, and then it turns out when America is kind of pushing the brakes and America doesn't do what it's kind of expected to do, and the European countries were not ready for that. And even in the share of GDP that they need to invest in NATO is still discussed, and not all the countries of NATO, they actually realize this investment, they realize these NATO payments. Maybe this kind of goes along with this isolation trend in America. Well, actually, it is happening there for the last 3 years, and not only because of the threats of Trump, because those threats were declared back in 2016. He was threatening that he's going to leave NATO, and he spoke about it during his presidential campaign of 2016. But it's also happening because there is a war in Europe. There is a war in Europe, and the Europeans understand that. this war is kind of far away, and Europe feels it only through refugees and the money that they need to spend on those refugees and the money that they need to spend to support Ukraine. But Europe already went through 2 world wars, and Europe knows what the World War is, and Europe is very much afraid of the World War, and this is also one of the reasons why are people so cautious about the support of Ukraine, and they hope that Putin is going to get exhausted. And here we face a problem, because sadly Putin is not going to get exhausted. It's not Putin like one person who is going to die tomorrow and things will change. No, nevertheless it's a more serious problem that Europe faces. And maybe this problem won't be solved once and for all. It's very easy to say, dethrone Putin in Russia, but how to do it? When it's a very rich country with serious human resources and financial resources, and on top of that, nuclear weapons. So it may turn out that it's impossible to overthrow this regime, but this regime can be isolated along the line Sweden, Finland, Belarus, Poland. Along this line, maybe not literally, but we can build a sort of Berlin Wall. But this wall will be built by us, not by them. And maybe then it will be possible to isolate Putin. And maybe wait for another August of 1991 in Russia and see what's going to happen. But Europe cannot give up Ukraine, sadly. And I want to emphasize this sadly, because if you approach it cynically and say, if everything would look like this, Putin wants to get Ukraine and that's it, and then he becomes this fluffy rabbit, and then you can cry, you can close your eyes, and you can sacrifice Ukraine, but it's not like that. Yes, right, we already went through this. There was one such Putin who was given Austria, Czechoslovakia based on the same grounds. And in contrast to such people like Daladier and Chamberlain, who took part in so-called Munich conspiracy, they didn't have such historical experience. And today's European leaders, they do. And we just know what happens when you feed this animal that is represented by the dictator and who is trying to occupy whole Europe. Well, yes, sadly, we have this historical experience, but somehow we act the same way as our ancestors. See, the First and the Second World Wars, they were a result of the fact that America was not involved in solving European problems. And this is exactly what Trump promises us. He is saying that America is going to leave European problems so that Europe will be dealing with its own issues and will be addressing its issues and fighting the threats it has. Sadly, Europe is arranged in such a way that the balance of forces there can be easily destabilized. In fact, America is not participating in European problems. In fact, is the direct path to the Third World War, because Trump's refusal to take part in the issues of Europe's security will break the balance of forces in Europe, will break the balance of nuclear forces in Europe, because only the UK and France have nuclear weapons and Germany doesn't have it. It turns out that America is the only defender of Germany in case of a nuclear conflict. Yes, and in fact, it's very important participation to keep this nuclear umbrella going. In fact, this will create a huge point of temptation for Putin in order to finally, as he may think, to solve all his problems and to get back that influence that the Soviet Union used to have. And he used to say that this is his ideal. It's not just the point to take over the territories they used to have, including Eastern European, but also he wants to return the influence that the Soviet Union had. And that's why I'm saying that sadly, this temptation to solve all problems like that, using a 4-year pause, I think it will be quite significant. And I think, yes, it may lead to a world war. You know, Yuri, what actually surprises me a lot, in fact, starting with the Munich speech of 2007, Putin directly was speaking about his goals, and the view of the world that he had in his head was approximately clear. And what you said, in fact, from the very beginning, he announced that he's not talking only about particular Ukraine or particular Georgia. He was talking about his attempt to change the balance of powers in the world, to change the world order, kind of break it, and in a sense bring back the configuration that used to be during the Soviet time. And at the same time, the people who are standing on the anti-war positions, they look at it in a simplified way from the point of view of Putin. So why Ukraine wanted to become part of NATO? If Ukraine didn't do this, then this wouldn't happen, because it was written in the document that Ukraine has a no-block status, and so why you were in trouble? So why you were doing this? And I think, in fact, the lack of understanding the real motives of Putin, no matter from what side, be it on American side or European side, I think this non-understanding of these motives is the reason why they choose a wrong recipe to counteract Putin. For example, like now, the sanctions to arrest the oil fleet of Russia, but they do it with such a delay that they don't get the effect they expected. So, and in a sense, I think that Trump's administration already faces a problem when Trump used to say that he's going to make a deal for just 24 hours, because he thought that this deal will be very simple. I'm a businessman, he has very pragmatic goals, and so we just agree on the land, they'll have a part of it, so we'll agree on the non-block status of Ukraine, and it's done. But now this one day turned into 6 months, and Kellogg said that it's going to be 100 days. Right now they're in a certain deadlock, and it's just what you said. They can't resolve the situation because the other side has absolutely different goals. A couple of words about NATO and the attempts of Ukraine to join NATO, whether it's backdated or forward-dated, so to speak. In fact, we see that the only states that manage to keep their sovereignty and independence, and peace, by the way, in their lands, these are the countries that managed to join NATO. This is Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Poland, Romania, and now Finland and Sweden did this. All other countries, all other territories, like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, if we take into account what's happening in Transnistria, they constantly live, so to speak, in a fire of war, or they live under the constant threat that the Russian troops will invade them. I think it's a wrong statement that not joining NATO will guarantee security for the country. We have a very good example of Belarus. Belarus never tried to join NATO. And who is now the master of Belarus? The Russian Federation. So, not joining NATO, as we can see it, is the direct way, direct path to be under Russia. Of course, now I will be sort of fantasizing a little bit, but I have an impression that Trump with Putin, they are planning to make some sort of Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. I think that they'll want to divide the world. And I even see how it's going to be happening from the point of view of Putin. He might say, Europe is ours, and you will take Canada, Greenland, we can give it to you, Panama Canal. So this will be your zone of influence. So you'll get NATO, and we'll get Europe. I don't think anything like that happened during the Soviet time. The borderline should be somewhere in the middle of Europe, right? Well, along the border of Greenland, probably. This is where this bordering line will be. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating, but I suspect that I'm not exaggerating too much. I think this is how Putin envisions it. I don't know how Trump sees it. I don't know if Trump is ready to give up Europe to Putin in exchange for Canada and Greenland, but I suppose that he is ready, because again, he's a person who thinks pretty primitively, and he is doing it as if he is buying real estate, because see, he sent his son to Greenland, and Trump's son deals with matters of real estate in Trump's business. That's why for Trump, it's a matter of buying real estate in Greenland. See, we're getting here to a very interesting topic. This is your book. You presented this book at the 13th Forum of Free Russia, and you spoke about it, and participants of the forum, they could buy the book, and thank you very much. I have a copy with your autograph for my wife. The book is very interesting, and here we talked about Putin's motivation. But what to do with Trump's motivation? It is clear that his core constituency has very strong positions of isolation. But then there is his biography, and in your book, Multiple Moves Game of the Century, Donald Trump and Dmitry Rybolyov on the Leash of the Kremlin. And in this book, you present a lot of interesting facts. You also quote an interview with Oleg Kalugin, who is used to be a head of foreign intelligence, and he speaks about very interesting things. I understand, to a certain degree, this is a conspiracy theory topic, and in the book you say that it's very difficult to prove that the person was recruited, that the person is an agent. This is a very complex structures and nets, and you say there was a Russian diplomat who lived in the same building with Trump for a long time. So what do you think? Is there this compromising evidence that may help pressure Trump? And can it be like a decisive factor in Trump's decisions? Well, you see, compromising evidence compromised itself, and it's kind of funny way to put it, because it's not a tool of pressure anymore. I don't know what can be shown to the Russian public or to the international public, what they should show to them so that Putin's support would drop down to zero. What can you show? How he eats infants right in front of camera or what? There is nothing that can be shown to the modern viewer or to tell to the modern listener so that this fact would change their point of view. It is sad, but this is a fact. For 4 years, when Trump was the president, they didn't say a good word about him in the mainstream media, both in the United States and in Europe. And Trump didn't lose one single vote during the elections, as it turned out. Well, remember that this sex scandal, Stormy Daniels story, these criminal cases, the story with the money, the case with the money that they proved that when he bought this real estate when he was on the brink of bankruptcy. Well, it's true that it doesn't influence anything. He had all this and he won the election. So that's why, yes, we should forget about compromising evidence. So it's impossible to prove recruitment, that they recruited the agent. And this is what Oleg Kalugin told me. It's almost impossible to prove because all these recruitments, they are very different. As he said, there are no two similar recruitments, but there are certain indicators. And these indicators, they're pretty primitive. The fact that Trump didn't say a bad word about Putin. No one word, only good words. And no matter what question he is asked, he always twists it in such a way so that he wouldn't say a bad word about Putin. When he was asked what he thinks about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Putin's decision to invade Ukraine 3 years ago, he said, Putin is a smart guy, he's a good man. See, it is one of the conditions of being a dependent agent. I'm saying that the presence of this dependence of Trump is pretty visible. And what it is based on and when it actually appeared, and it's a different conversation, and it's kind of, part of the history right now. Maybe it has to do with the money only. And since 2007, Trump took this money in big volumes, and this is a proven information. It's known. Another thing, like with the compromising evidence itself, it's not the reason to change your opinion towards Trump. Well, Trump was taking the money, so whatever, everybody was taking money. I can even say that everybody took Russia's money, everybody who could, they did. Some more, some less. Just not every one of them became the president of the United States after that. Well, that's another business, right? There are certain litmus papers, so to speak. There's like simple questions, and by answering these questions, we can see whose point of view the person is defending. Some very primitive questions. For example, who poisoned Alexander Litvinenko? Everybody knows who did that. Trump answers this question that he doesn't know who poisoned Litvinenko. Who is behind poisoning Skripal's family? Trump is saying that he doesn't know who poisoned this family. Who is Crimea? And clearly Trump is saying Crimea belongs to Russia. Did Russia get involved in the elections of 2016? No, Russia didn't get involved in this election. But in fact, the involvement of Russia in the 2016 election was, and we can argue whether it was important or not, but the fact that Russia did get involved, it's a fact. Who is to blame for Russo-Ukrainian war? And Trump is saying that Ukraine is to blame for it because Ukraine was provoking it, right? There is no single point, no single question on Putin or on Russian policy where the party to blame will be Russia in Trump's answers or Putin. And this is probably the best indication that Trump has this agent dependence, let alone how Trump behaves with Putin. Remember that meeting in Helsinki? It was just amazing. Everybody was surprised. And let alone the fact that Trump tried constantly to be with Putin one-on-one without the participation of American officials, which is quite non-typical for the President of the United States. Such situations never happened, neither before nor after. So there are many indications that Trump acts in a certain way with Putin, and he doesn't feel free and independent with him. But you see, oftentimes in the history, at least in the history of Russian special agencies, secret agencies, when an agent overgrows his supervisor and becomes more important, you mean more independent and self-sufficient? Well, for example, Yumashev and Korzhakov. Korzhakov used to be the head of the security detail of the president. In the beginning of his career, Korzhakov was supervisor of Yumashev, and Yumashev was the husband of Yeltsin's daughters. And Korzhakov was gone from the stage, and Yumashev kind of stayed there for as long as he could. And the same transformation can happen to Trump and Putin, because for the time of 2016, Putin was his supervisor. And I wouldn't exclude the fact that that they had a secret meeting in Moscow in 2013. Yes, right, when there was this competition, Miss Universe, I think. This is how it was called. But it may be that Trump, during his second term, will realize that he overgrew his supervisor, and then we will see something different. Because again, I repeat that compromise on evidence doesn't work. And if even we suppose that Putin has some compromise on evidence against Trump, and I'm sure he has it, since Trump was in Moscow, and if we trust Kalugin, then this compromising evidence exists. But this evidence is fake news, it's Photoshop. Yes, right. You can just throw it away. This evidence doesn't work anymore, and it doesn't work either way. And Trump, I think, knows it. And it's not just he knows it, he can see it in his experience, because compromising evidence doesn't work, because no other president with such a huge volume of compromising evidence could move just one step even to the point of candidacy. But Trump, with all this pile of evidence, actually managed to win for the second time. So we should forget about the compromising evidence. But at the same time, it can work both ways. If Putin had this compromising evidence as a tool to pressure Trump before, now Putin can forget about this evidence. Yuri, it's very interesting. Could you tell us your book, this multi-moves game, where people can buy it? Can they buy it on Amazon? Because I'm sure that many people would like to buy it. Well, you see, the book was published in Germany, in Leipzig, and it was published in Russian by a German publisher, and this publisher publishes books in different languages. They also published my book in German, the book that's called From Red Terror to Mafia State, and you can actually buy it via internet in Europe. It's even easier to do than in America, and if you just type in multi-moves game and in my name, so so you'll find it. The book is quite nice. Yuri, we've been on air for more than an hour and actually would keep talking to you because there are lots of topics to address and we discussed a lot of them, and in fact many more are left to discuss. Thank you very much for your time and thank you very much for inviting me. And we've discussed many things, we've made some forecasts, and let's see what's going to happen. We'll see who is right and where we are going. In any case, we live in a very interesting time and many interesting things can happen and sweeping changes are ahead of us. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.